You know, usually when we talk about a classic single malt Scottish whiskey, there is a very specific, almost cinematic image that instantly pops into your head.
Oh, definitely.
Like you are probably picturing it right now. It is that romanticized, picture-perfect 19th century farmyard aesthetic.
Right. The rolling green hills.
Exactly. You've got the rolling green hills, maybe a little babbling brook cutting through a peat bog somewhere.
A little cluster of whitewashed cottages.
Yes. And, of course, that iconic pagoda roof jutting up into a misty, rain-swept sky.
It feels ancient. It feels quiet.
Deeply pastoral, yeah. And, frankly, it is completely engineered to make you feel like you are drinking history directly from the earth.
It is the aesthetic we have all been, heavily conditioned to expect, largely because the industry has spent the last 40 years selling us that exact idyllic, untouched Scottish landscape.
Right.
It is comforting. And honestly, a lot of the major heritage distilleries lean into that imagery because it works.
Oh, absolutely. It sells.
It sells the idea of the lone craftsman turning barley and water into liquid gold in a quiet glen.
Exactly. But today, we are throwing that cliche completely out the window because today's deep dive is taking us somewhere fundamentally different.
Very different.
I want you to imagine standing on the banks of the River Teith. We are in Scottish Highlands near the village of Deanston. You are about 8 miles north of Stirling, right at the gateway to the Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park.
Beautiful area.
It is. But instead of looking at a quaint, whitewashed barn or a manicured visitor center, you are craning your neck to look up at a colossal, towering, brutalist stone factory.
Yeah, it is massive.
It is imposing. It looks like it was built for grinding heavy industry, not for crafting delicate, nuanced spirits.
Well, because it was. And that striking visual and historical contrast is exactly what makes the story we're unpacking today so incredibly compelling.
It really is.
It is a total anomaly in the landscape of Scotch whiskey.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to explore the fascinating and honestly quite improbable evolution of Deanston Distillery.
And we have some great material for this.
We really do. We are relying on a fantastic stack of source material today, specifically a highly detailed profile and some incredibly rigorous tasting analytics provided by Whisky.dk.
Yeah, their stuff is excellent.
And I have to say, integrating their research into this deep dive was a joy because the team over at Whisky.dk has one of the most rigorous palates and analytical approaches in Denmark.
For sure. They have been operating since 2012, right?
Yes, 2012. Founded by Ulrik Bertelsen and Henrik Olsen. And they aren't just, moving bottles. They have this massive 500 square meter showroom in Vesterpru.
Which is huge.
It is. And they have won multiple Danish Gazelle Awards.
Which, just for our non-Danish listeners, is a massive benchmark for business growth and entrepreneurship.
Right. It is a huge deal. They focus heavily on the education behind the spirit, hosting masterclasses that strip away the marketing fluff.
Exactly. They look past the pastoral romance and get right to the core of the liquid. And their profile on Deanston is brilliant, precisely because they highlight that this isn't just a standard tasting note exercise.
No, not at all.
This is a story of macroeconomic survival. It is a story of heavy industrial reinvention.
Yes.
It is about how a massive 18th century cotton mill managed to transform itself into one of the most characterful, sustainable, and structurally modern single malts in all of Scotland.
Without losing its brutalist soul, which is the best part.
Exactly.
So let's start with that building, because as Whisky.dk rightly points out, you simply cannot understand the liquid in the glass without understanding the architecture of the space it is made in.
The physical building dictated its entire future.
It really did. We are going way back to 1785, which is wild to think about. 1785.
It is a long time ago.
The Industrial Revolution is just starting to truly bare its teeth. The French Revolution hasn't even happened yet.
We are talking about the absolute bleeding edge of early industrialization here.
Right.
When this monolithic structure was erected on the River Teith, it was called the Adelphi Mill. And it was one of Scotland's very first water-powered cotton mills.
A technological marvel of its time.
It really was. It was designed using the direct engineering principles of Sir Richard Arkwright.
Arkwright.
Right. Arkwright, of course, being the pioneer behind the water frame. That is the technology that figured out how to harness the immense raw kinetic power of moving water to automate the spinning of cotton.
Which basically moves society away from the cottage industry and straight into the modern factory system.
Exactly.
So they build this behemoth directly on the river to capture that raw kinetic energy. And the scale of it is just staggering for the 18th century. We aren't talking about a small water wheel grinding grain for the local village.
Oh, not at all. For nearly 180 years, the Adelphi Mill was a beating heart of the British textile empire.
Wow.
We are talking about giant, churning water wheels that were eventually upgraded to highly efficient, massive industrial turbines as the technology evolved over the decades.
Just nonstop power.
Right. There were hundreds of workers clocking in and out every single day. The labor demand was so intense that an entire mill village—
The village of Deanston itself, right.
Exactly. The village of Deanston was essentially constructed around the factory just to house and support the workforce.
That is incredible.
It was a complete self-sustaining ecosystem entirely dedicated to the mass production of textiles.
But then, as happens with so many heavy industrial giants, the macroeconomic winds change. We hit the mid-20th century, and the textile industry in Scotland essentially collapses.
It falls apart.
Right. The post-World War II economic shift, the global supply chains reorganize, manufacturing moves to cheaper labor markets overseas.
And suddenly this bustling, roaring factory goes dead quiet.
It is the classic, often tragic, post-industrial story. You have this massive, purpose-built infrastructure that is suddenly rendered entirely obsolete.
The workers leave?
Yeah. The massive looms stop, the turbines are decoupled, and you are left with an empty stone behemoth echoing by the river.
And this is where the pivot happens.
Oh.
This is where the story goes from a depressing tale of rest belt industrial decay to something structurally brilliant.
Okay, but I have to push back a little here because repurposing a textile mill for distilling spirits doesn't immediately strike me as a one-to-one transition.
Oh, sure.
I mean, the thermodynamics of a loom floor versus a still house are entirely different. The load-bearing requirements for washbacks holding tens of thousands of liters of fermenting liquid are immense.
Very true.
So why didn't they just tear it down and build a purpose-built distillery?
That is exactly the right question to ask. And the answer lies in the sheer over-engineering of the original Adelphi mill.
Okay.
What is fascinating here is why this abandoned cotton mill was so serendipitously suited to become a heavy output distillery.
Right.
Think about it. When you want to make whiskey on an industrial scale, what are the primary infrastructural bottlenecks?
Well, you need a massive footprint, obviously. You need an unfathomable amount of load-bearing capacity for the equipment. You need a constant supply of cooling water for the condensers, and you need raw power.
Precisely. And the Adelphi mill had all of those solved before the first mash was ever drawn.
Wow.
The founders of the distillery didn't have to go out into an empty field, lay a foundation, and build a massive facility from scratch at exorbitant capital cost.
Which saves millions.
Exactly. They inherited these incredibly thick, heavily reinforced stone walls. Now, those walls were built to withstand the intense vibrations of hundreds of industrial looms.
Right.
But incidentally, thick stone naturally buffers ambient temperature swings.
Oh.
Oh.
Which is the absolute holy grail for maturing whiskey casks.
Exactly. You want a slow, steady interaction with the wood, not massive temperature spikes.
Ah. So the architectural defense against loom vibration became the perfect thermal mass for the maturation warehouses. That is brilliant.
It is. And they already had the cavernous, sprawling floors with massive weight tolerances.
Right, because of the heavy machinery.
Exactly. They could easily drop in giant mash tuns and rows of washbacks without worrying about the floor collapsing.
Makes sense.
Furthermore, they had a massive, steady supply of crisp, clean water right outside the window from the River Teith.
And in distillation, as you know, water is your lifeblood.
Totally. You need it for mashing, you need it for reducing the spirit, but overwhelmingly, you need it for the shell and tube condensers to cool the alcoholic vapors back into liquid.
And crucially, the power infrastructure was already built directly into the foundations of the building.
That is the masterstroke right there. They had the dams, the lathes.
The engineered channels that direct the river water to increase its velocity, right?
Right, the lathes.
Oh.
And the turbine systems. All of it was sitting there fully integrated into the site, just waiting to be engaged.
That is wild.
It was, as the Whisky.dk analysis puts it, almost written in stone that this building's next chapter had to be whiskey. It was an accidental but physically inevitable destiny.
It makes me think of an analogy from the modern tech world.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it is like someone today stumbling across a massive, abandoned heavy manufacturing plant from the 1990s. It is totally empty, but it is already wired with industrial-grade fiber optics.
Right.
It has massive reinforced concrete floors and a state-of-the-art closed-loop water cooling system. You wouldn't bulldoze it to build condos.
No, you'd use it.
You would look at it and realize this is the absolute perfect physical shell to build a hyperscale server farm for cloud computing. The skeleton of the building practically demands the new organism.
That is a fantastic structural comparison. The infrastructure dictates the application.
But that raises a massive historical question for me.
Yeah.
If this site was so incredibly perfect for making whiskey and they had all this infrastructure ready to go in the 1960s, why isn't Deanston from the 1960s famous as a standalone single malt? I mean, if I look at the auction markets for 1960s distillations, I see Macallan, I see Bowmore, I see Springbank. Why wasn't Deanston immediately producing this highly praised, critically acclaimed single malt right out of the gate?
To understand that, you have to completely divorce yourself from the modern whiskey enthusiast's mindset.
Okay.
You really have to look at the brutal realities of the global whiskey market in the mid-1960s.
Right.
The conversion from cotton mill to Deanston Distillery officially took place between 1965 and 1966, and the landscape back then was a completely different universe.
Right, because today we are obsessed with terroir, single casks, distillery character, knowing exactly which exact still produced the liquid in our glass.
But back then, anonymity was the name of the game.
Really?
The global market was utterly, completely dominated by blended whiskeys. Single malts were largely considered by the major producers to be too harsh, too idiosyncratic, or simply too difficult to market on a global scale.
To a consumer base that just wanted smooth, consistent, interchangeable beverages.
Exactly. People wanted branded blends. The industry was geared toward volume, consistency, and brand identity at the blending house level, not the distillery level.
So when they retrofitted the Adelphi mill and finally fired up the stills at Deanston for the first time in 1966, the boardroom strategy wasn't, let's craft the ultimate Deanston single malt to sell in a beautiful bespoke bottle to connoisseurs.
Not even remotely. They built a modern, high-volume, highly efficient liquid factory inside that old stone shell.
Wow.
We were talking about 4 incredibly large pot stills, massive mash tuns, and a staggering initial production capacity of around 3 million liters of pure alcohol a year.
That is a serious heavyweight industrial output for the 1960s.
3 million liters.
That is a literal river of alcohol.
And almost every single drop of that was destined to be what the industry affectionately or sometimes pejoratively calls blend fodder.
Blend fodder.
Deanston was designed from day one to be a workhorse. Its sole job was to churn out a high-quality, structurally sound, highly consistent Highland spirit that could be sold in massive bulk tankers to the major blending houses. It provided the sweet, fruity backbone for global blends. The consumer in New York or Tokyo drinking the blend would never, ever know the name Deanston.
And the accountants running Deanston were perfectly happy with that arrangement because the cash flow was tremendous.
Exactly. It was a pure volume business, a B2B model.
They were just turning the crank, pumping out millions of liters, loading it into tankers, and cashing the checks. It is almost a direct continuation of the cotton mill philosophy, right?
Well, absolutely.
Mass production of a raw material to be refined elsewhere.
Exactly. For a good 15 years, that was the uninterrupted life of Deanston. They were highly successful, highly profitable, but entirely behind the curtain.
But then, well, then the music stops.
Yeah.
And it stops violently. We hit the early 1980s, and the Whisky.dk source describes this period for Deanston as the dark days.
It was bleak.
I want to dive deep into 1982 because this wasn't just a Deanston problem. This was a macroeconomic earthquake for all of Scotland.
It was an absolute bloodbath. To understand 1982, you have to understand the infamous Whiskey Lock.
The Whiskey Lake.
Right, the Whiskey Lake of the 1980s. Throughout the late 60s and 70s, the industry had operated on these incredibly optimistic, almost hubristic linear growth models. They extrapolated the post-war boom and assumed global demand for blended scotch would just climb infinitely forever.
Right, the classic forecasting error.
Yeah.
They were distilling based on projected sales 10 years in the future, totally ignoring the changing geopolitical and cultural landscape.
Totally.
You had the oil shocks of the 70s, massive global inflation, severe economic recessions in their key markets.
Yeah.
And culturally, you had a massive generational shift away from dark spirits toward clear spirits like vodka and white rum.
Precisely. The boomers didn't want to drink what their parents drank. So suddenly, by the early 80s, the blenders realized their sales were plummeting.
Right.
They stopped buying bulk spirit from the distilleries. And almost overnight, there was an ocean, a literal lock of maturing whiskey sitting in Scottish warehouses that absolutely nobody wanted to buy.
Wow.
The spot price for bulk spirit crashed through the floor.
And if you are a distillery like Deanston, whose entire operational model, whose entire cash flow relies on selling massive, steady volumes of bulk spirit to those blenders,
Right.
and the blenders suddenly cancel all their contracts, I mean, you are in fatal trouble. You have no standalone brand to fall back on.
Fatal's the right word.
Yeah.
In 1982, the owners of Deanston looked at the ledger and had to make the hardest call in the heavy industry playbook.
Which was?
They mothballed the distillery.
Mothballed. It is such a chilling clinical term in the industry. It sounds temporary, but so often it is a death sentence.
It really is. It means you don't just reduce shifts.
Yeah.
You sever the entire operation. The fires under the massive stills are extinguished.
Wow.
The hydro turbines in the river are halted and locked. The entire workforce, many of whom lived in the village that depended solely on the mill, is let go.
That is devastating.
The only thing left in that cavernous, echoing 18th century stone monolith is the maturing stock, sitting silently in the bonded warehouses, slowly oxidizing in the dark, waiting for a market that might never return.
Just absolute profound silence.
Yeah.
After nearly 2 centuries of continuous deafening noise, first from the clanking of thousands of cotton spinning machines, and then from the roar of the distillery pumps and boilers, it just goes dead quiet.
Eerie.
It really could have been the end of the line. We have seen so many legendary distilleries from that specific era. Port Ellen, Brora, Rosebank get demolished, stripped for copper, and turned into housing developments or grocery store parking lots.
It was a very real, imminent possibility for Deanston. The carrying costs of a massive site like that are not trivial.
Right.
It sat completely silent for 8 long years. The 1980s were a graveyard for Scottish distilleries.
But then comes the rebirth.
Yes.
In 1990, the macroeconomic cycle starts to turn, and a company called Stewart Distillers steps in and acquires the dormant property. They unlock the gates, decouple the turbines, and turn the lights back on.
Yeah, it was a huge turning point.
Okay, so Stewart buys them in 1990. Let's look at the corporate strategy here. Who was Stewart at the time, and why did they want this silent, massive giant when the industry was just barely staggering out of a recession?
Well, Stewart was an independent, highly ambitious, and aggressively growing player in the early 1990s.
Okay.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of corporate portfolio strategy, their acquisition of Deanston wasn't just about buying cheap capacity. It was a highly calculated strategic assembly.
Interesting.
Stewart was actively building out their own proprietary blending operations, primarily to support and expand their flagship blend, brands like Scottish Leader and Black Bottle.
Ah, I see. They wanted vertical integration.
Exactly.
They were tired of buying bulk spirit on the open market and wanted to control their own supply chain from grain to glass.
Exactly. And look at the specific triad of distilleries they put together to achieve that. They had acquired Tobermory over on the Isle of Mull.
Okay.
They had Bunnahabhain over on the Isle of Islay. And now they had Deanston right in the heart of the Highlands.
That is an incredibly deliberate geographical and organoleptic spread. It is not random at all.
It is the ultimate blender's toolkit.
Yeah.
When you are constructing a complex blend, you need distinct structural pillars. You have Islay, via Bunnahabhain, to provide the heavy, robust maritime elements.
Right.
You have Mull, via Tobermory, for the funky, slightly coastal, versatile island character. And Deanston became the absolute crucial, unpeated Highland backbone.
It provided the high-gravity, sweet, fruity, textural foundation that those blends needed to hold all the other disparate elements together.
Precise.
Here is where it gets really interesting to me, looking at the historical timeline. It is precisely during this era, the 1990s, when Deanston is operating full tilt as this crucial blending backbone for Stewart's Scottish Leader, that they start doing something a little subversive.
Oh, yeah.
They slowly, almost quietly, start sneaking out bottles of single malt under the Deanston name.
It is true. It started as a tiny trickle. A 12-year-old release here, a special unchill filtered bottling there. What happened was the master blenders at Stewart, who were intimately working with the spirit every day, realized that the liquid they were producing in these massive old cotton mill halls was structurally exceptional on its own.
It didn't just have to be the invisible mortar holding the bricks of a blend together.
Right. It was complex enough to be the building itself.
But establishing that identity as a standalone, premium single malt was really forged in the fire of some massive corporate boardroom drama over the next 2 decades, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because Burn Stewart doesn't stay an independent maverick forever. As the whiskey boom accelerates into the 21st century, we move into the era of global multinational buyout.
Right. Welcome to the modern, hyper-consolidated spirits industry.
Here we go.
In 2013, Burn Stewart, and therefore the entire triad of Deanston, Tobermory, and Bunnahabhain, is acquired lock, stock, and barrel by the Distill Group,
Okay.
which is a massive South African beverage conglomerate heavily invested in wines and brandies.
Now, let's pause here, because normally when a giant international conglomerate swoops in and buys a characterful, slightly idiosyncratic Scottish distillery, whiskey enthusiasts get incredibly nervous.
Always.
The immediate assumption is that the MBA accountants are going to demand cost-cutting, increased yields, shorter fermentations, and the complete homogenization of the spirit.
To appeal to the widest, blandest global denominator.
Exactly.
You absolutely worry about that, and history gives us plenty of examples where that exact tragedy occurred.
Right.
But the source material from Whisky.dk emphatically notes that the Distell acquisition actually marked a profoundly positive paradigm shift for Deanston.
Really?
Yeah. Distell's global strategy wasn't to squeeze Deanston for more cheap blend fodder. They recognized that the premium single malt category was exploding globally by 2013.
Ah, they saw the trend.
They needed a strong, authentic single malt portfolio to compete with Diageo and Pernod Ricard. So suddenly, Deanston gets a massive injection of capital, focus, and marketing resources entirely dedicated to elevating it as a standalone brand.
Yeah. So they effectively unshackled it from its primary duty to the blending vats.
Exactly.
And the corporate musical chairs didn't stop with Distell. Jump forward a decade to 2023, and Distell's entire spirits division gets swallowed up in a massive takeover by Heineken.
Yes, the ubiquitous green bottle global beer giant.
Right. And this massive restructuring results in the creation of a new entity called CVH Spirits Limited.
Which brings us to the current operational structure today. Deanston, Bunnahabhain, and Tobermory are still intact, acting as the beating heart of this new CVH portfolio.
Okay.
And what is truly remarkable about the internal dynamics of that portfolio is that Deanston, the old cotton mill that spent decades in anonymity, is now the absolute largest distillery in that entire group.
Really?
Yes, both in sheer volumetric production capacity and in strategic brand importance.
I want to look closely at how those three specific distilleries function together today under CVH, because the source points out that they each have a highly defined, almost protected role. It is like a really well-balanced musical trio, and they go out of their way not to cannibalize each other's market share.
It's a great framework. Let's break down the siloing. You have Bunnahabhain on Islay.
Okay.
Now, while Islay is globally famous for heavy peat, Bunnahabhain's core identity is actually unpeated, but it is famous for its massive, rich, maritime, heavily sherry cask matured style. It is heavy, viscous, and coastal.
The heavy bass player laying down the deep groove.
Exactly. Then you have Tobermory on Mull, which produces both unpeated malt and a heavily peated variant called Ledaig.
Oh, Ledaig is great.
They completely own that funky, lactic, heavily coastal, industrial Smoke Island style.
The wild, unpredictable lead guitarist.
Which leaves Deanston. Deanston is fiercely protected as the grounded, vibrant, highly structured, modern Highland voice.
Got it.
It is unpeated. It is relentlessly clean. It is ester-driven and fruity with a massive textural weight. It provides the bright, complex structural harmony for the entire CVH portfolio.
So let's address the paradox here, because it is fascinating. You go from being an anonymous industrial workhorse in the 60s to a blending backbone in the 90s to being owned by a South African brandy conglomerate to being ultimately owned by the Heineken empire.
Right.
And yet, instead of becoming a bland, focus-grouped mass-market product, Deanston has somehow become more authentic, more transparent, and more stubbornly independent in its specific production style than ever before.
It really is the ultimate paradox of the modern whiskey business.
Yeah.
This raises an important question. How do they survive the corporate meat grinder without losing your soul?
Exactly. Usually, corporate consolidation smooths down the rough edges.
But CVH and Distell before them were remarkably astute. They analyzed the data and realized that in today's highly educated premium whiskey market, consumers actively reject smooth and boring.
Right.
They don't want a generic Highland malt. They want extreme specificity. They want transparency. They want a tangible sense of place.
That makes a lot of sense.
So instead of homogenizing Deanston, the corporate overlords actually allowed and funded the distillery to lean aggressively into its specific, localized, highly idiosyncratic product philosophy.
And that specific product philosophy is where we transition from the corporate boardroom history into the actual biochemical and thermodynamic nuts and bolts of how they make this stuff.
Yes, the fun part.
Because the way they make whiskey at Deanston is intrinsically physically linked to that giant stone building in the river flowing past its walls.
Exactly. Let's get into the mechanics of flavor, and the conversation has to start with power generation.
Power. We talked about Richard Arkwright and the kinetic energy of the water wheels in 1785, but Whisky.dk points out something structurally amazing about Deanston today.
Right.
They're practically self-sufficient when it comes to electricity, which for a heavy industrial plant in the 21st century is almost unheard of.
Yes. In a world where every major spirits brand is tripping over itself to release press statements claiming they're green or sustainable.
Right, usually achieved through dubious carbon offsets.
Or planting trees in another country, or buying abstract renewable energy credits.
Exactly. But Deanston is doing it the old-fashioned, hardcore, industrial engineering way.
They have a massive, modern hydro turbine system installed right in the River Teith, utilizing the exact same lathe systems that power the cotton mill.
Let's break down how that interfaces with the modern grid. They aren't just using the river water to cool the condensers, which every distillery does.
No.
They are using the sheer velocity of the teeth to spin copper coils and generate massive amperage. It means the river is literally generating the electricity to run the mash ton rakes, the heavy fluid pumps, the lighting, the control room computers.
It is functional, brutalist, industrial sustainability baked directly into their operational DNA.
Yeah.
It is not a marketing gimmick dreamt up by an agency in London. It is just the physical reality of how the building was engineered to operate from day one.
They're just swapping mechanical water wheels for electromagnetic turbines.
Exactly. Furthermore, when the river's running high and they generate excess power, they actually feed that surplus electricity back into the UK national grid.
It is incredible. It is like if you took a 200-year-old stone fortress and retrofitted it into an off-the-grid, hyper-efficient smart home. The shell is ancient, but the energy system is completely localized and sustainable.
It is a great image.
And the Whisky.dk source makes a great psychological point here. This immense self-sufficiency affects the whole self-image of the distillery.
Oh, for sure.
The operators working there see themselves not just as distillers, but as custodians of this functional industrial legacy. But okay, enough about the power grid. Let's talk about the biochemistry. What actually happens to the grain inside those walls?
It begins with the mashing and fermentation parameters. Whisky.dk notes that Deanston deliberately uses what are called clear, high-gravity worts,
Okay.
coupled with extremely long fermentation times.
Let's dive into the chemistry of that. I know our listeners understand the basic mashing process.
Right, extracting sugars from malted barley using hot water to create the wort.
Right. But the specific gravity targets are where a distillery defines its DNA. Why push for a high-gravity wort? You are essentially aiming for a much higher concentration of dissolved fermentable sugars, pushing the specific gravity way up.
Exactly. You are creating an incredibly dense, sugar-rich liquid environment. And when you introduce your yeast into that high-gravity environment, you are immediately subjecting those yeast cells to immense osmotic stress.
Osmotic stress.
Yeah. It is a very difficult environment for the yeast to work in compared to a standard, more diluted wort.
It is a biological tightrope, right? If the gravity is too high, the yeast can stall out completely and fail to ferment. But if you manage it correctly, that stress yields incredible results.
Right, because they use this high-gravity wort and then they refuse to rush the process. Let the fermentation run extremely long, often pushing well past 80 to 100 hours in those massive washbacks.
Walk us through the biochemical timeline of a 100-hour fermentation. The primary alcohol conversion happens relatively quickly, right?
Correct. For the first 48 hours, the yeast is just furiously consuming the available sugars and converting them into ethanol and carbon dioxide.
Okay.
If you stopped there, you would have a very basic, raw, cereal-forward distiller's beer.
Oh.
But because Deanston lets it sit for days after the primary sugar is depleted, the environment in the washback changes.
Interesting.
The yeast cells become starved of nitrogen and sugar. They begin to break down, and secondary bacterial fermentations begin to occur.
This is where the magic happens. The biological stress and the extended time trigger massive esterification pathways.
Precisely. The dying yeast and the lactic acid bacteria begin producing highly complex chemical compounds called esters,
Which are?
specifically things like isoamyl acetate and ethyl hexanoate. To the human palate, these esters translate directly as vibrant, complex fruit notes: green apple, pear drops, ripe banana, citrus zest.
So by deliberately stressing the yeast with high sugar and then starving it over 100 hours, they are engineering this incredibly fruity, clean, ester-heavy base liquid, right, the wash, before it ever even sees the inside of a copper still.
Exactly. They're building a massive foundational fruitiness. But then, well, then it hits the stills.
Okay.
And this is where the thermodynamic physics of distillation take over, and where Deanston's specific hardware completely alters the trajectory of the spirit.
I know this is where the gearheads really lean in. Let's talk about the copper geometry. Deanston has 4 incredibly large pot stills.
They do. And the Whisky.dk profile explicitly highlights the unique geometry of these stills. They have relatively narrow reflux bowls built into the necks.
Okay, let's unpack the thermodynamics of reflux here.
Sure.
Think of the still neck like a fractional distillation column in a petrochemical plant, or even a financial filter where only the most volatile, lightest assets make it to the top.
That is a fun way to look at it. As the liquid boils in the pot, a complex mixture of alcohols, water, esters, and heavy lipid compounds vaporize and rise up the copper neck.
Right, but the ambient temperature of the distillery air cools the copper neck. As that mixed vapor travels up, it hits the cooler copper, the heavier compounds, the long-chain fatty acids, the heavy oils.
They condense back into a liquid state much faster than the later ethanol vapors.
So those heavy oils condense on the walls of the neck and literally fall back down into the boiling pot to be reboiled. That physical process of falling back is reflux.
Right.
The more times a vapor falls back and gets reboiled, the lighter, purer, and more ethereal the final spirit becomes, because you are systematically filtering out all the heavy oils.
A textbook explanation. Distilleries that want a very light, delicate floral whiskey, like a Glenmorangie, for example, use incredibly tall stills or incorporate wide boiling balls to maximize that copper contact and maximize the reflux.
They want all those heavy oils to fall back.
But Deanston stills are engineered to do the exact opposite.
Really?
Correct.
Okay.
Deanston stills are designed with these narrow bowls, which deliberately restricts the reflux. There simply isn't a large, wide, cool copper surface area for the vapor to hit and condense on. The vapor has a relatively clear, fast, unimpeded path up the neck, through the line arm, and into the condenser.
So the fractional filter is essentially wide open. Fewer of those heavy vapors are falling back into the pot. More of the heavy, complex stuff makes it all the way over the top and into the final spirit receiver.
Exactly. Because the vapor escapes more easily, the resulting raw spirit, the new and dear, retains a massive payload of heavier, richer chemical compounds.
Like what?
Specifically, it retains a vast amount of natural oils, long-chain fatty acids, and lipid-like waxes derived from the original malted barley.
Which translates directly to the tactile experience in the mouth.
Yes. When you take a sip of Deanston, you aren't just perceiving flavors on your olfactory receptors, you are physically feeling a texture on your palate.
Wow.
It has this heavier, fuller, distinctly waxy mouthfeel. It coats the tongue and the cheeks in a very substantial, satisfying way.
So let's contrast that specific textural profile with some of its famous Highland neighbors to give you, the listener, a precise organoleptic point of reference. If you put Deanston in a blind lineup of Highland malts, how does it physically stand out?
Well, the Whisky.dk source compares it directly to a couple of heavyweight Highland peers to illustrate the point.
Yeah.
Take Glenturret, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
Glenturret operates with different mashing and distillation parameters, and it can be very biscuit heavy, very dense, malty, and doughy. It tastes like roasted grain.
Right.
Or look at Aberfeldy. Aberfeldy is the classic textbook honey and malt Highland profile. It is very round, very sweet.
And Deanston?
Deanston sits in its own entirely unique structural lane. Because of that 100-hour fermentation we discussed, you get this incredibly clean, bright, soaring, ester-driven fruitiness.
Think sharp citrus zest, crispy green apples, orchard fruits.
Exactly. But because of the restricted reflux in the narrow neck stills, that bright fruit is anchored to this massive, waxy, heavy texture. It also has a dry, almost Venus-meaning wine-like nerve running through the finish.
It is a fascinating structural contradiction. Bright, airy fruit, anchored by heavy, oily wax. And as the source strongly emphasizes, it is deliberately not a heavy, sulfury sherry bomb like a Macallan or its sister distillery, Bunnahabhain.
Right.
And it is not a salty, iodine-heavy maritime malt like Old Pulteney. It is a grounded, highly engineered, modern Highland voice. Fruit, honey, and waxy texture are the absolute focal points.
But here is the critical vulnerability in their entire process.
Uh-oh.
Producing such a highly textured, lipid-heavy, waxy spirit requires a massive, uncompromising commitment from the distillery when it comes time to actually put that liquid into a glass bottle.
Ah, the bottling line.
All that careful biochemical work in the washback, all that specific thermodynamic engineering in the still can be instantly and permanently ruined at the bottling line if the corporate accountants get involved.
Right, which brings us to the concept of honest whiskey in the actual Deanston portfolio. Whisky.dk makes a massive point about Deanston's unyielding bottling philosophy.
Yes.
They state that the core releases are consistently bottled at 46.3% ABV. They are strictly non-chill filtered, and they possess zero added caramel coloring.
Those three technical specifications, 46.3% ABV minimum, non-chill filtered natural color, are the absolute holy trinity for educated whiskey enthusiasts. It is the baseline demand of the modern connoisseur.
Let's dive into the physical chemistry of why that matters. Specifically for Deanston, we know what chill filtration is. Chilling the whiskey down to 0 degrees Celsius to force the fatty acids to clump together into micelles.
Right.
And then forcing the liquid through fine filters to strip them out so the whiskey never gets cloudy in a glass with ice. But why is it specifically disastrous for Deanston to do this?
Because of everything we just talked about regarding the stills, chill filtration is a purely cosmetic process designed to prevent a harmless cosmetic haze. But those chemical compounds that clump together when cold, the ones the mass market producers are so terrified of, are the exact same long-chain fatty acids, esters, and lipid oils that Deanston's narrow reflux bowls worked so incredibly hard to carry over into the spirit.
The irony is staggering. If Deanston chill filtered their whiskey to appease a casual consumer who wants their whiskey to look like perfectly clear iced tea, they would be mechanically filtering out their own signature distillery character.
Exactly.
They would literally be stripping the waxiness out of the liquid.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They would be chemically neutering their own carefully engineered spirit. By choosing to bottle without chill filtration, they protect the physical texture. And the ABV is crucial here, too.
Right, the flocculation threshold.
Exactly. At 40% ABV, the legal minimum, there isn't enough ethanol to keep those heavy oils in solution at room temperature. The whiskey will naturally turn cloudy. But by bumping the alcohol up to 46.3%, the higher ethanol concentration acts as a solvent, naturally keeping those complex oils dissolved and suspended in the liquid without needing to filter them out.
This is what they fundamentally mean by their marketing slogan, honest whiskey. It is not just a catchy phrase. It is a technical commitment.
Totally.
They're showing you the natural, naked, chemically intact character of the spirit. They absolutely refuse to polish away the textural rough edges for mass market, supermarket appeal.
It is whiskey made by a small local team inside a raw, giant industrial building, and it tastes exactly like what it is. It is unapologetic, structurally sound liquid.
Okay, let's get into the glass and look at how this philosophy manifests across their core range. Let's do a virtual tasting based on the Whisky.dk analytics, starting with the absolute benchmark flagship, the Deanston 12-year-old.
The 12-year-old is the foundational text. If you want to understand the Deanston DNA, this is where you must start. It is aged primarily in first fill and refill ex-bourbon casks.
And from a maturation chemistry standpoint, why lean so heavily on ex-bourbon casks, which are made of American white oak, Quercus alba, rather than European oak sherry casks for their flagship expression?
Because American white oak ex-bourbon casks impart highly specific lactones and phenolic aldehydes, flavors of vanilla, toasted coconut, and light caramel.
Okay.
Crucially, American oak is generally much less aggressive and tannic than European oak sherry casks. The bourbon cask supports and elevates the bright, ester-driven, fruity nature of Deanston's new make spirit without obliterating it.
The cask acts as a supportive pedestal, not a heavy mask.
Exactly.
So when you nose and taste the 12-year-old, how do those elements integrate?
You are immediately greeted by a massive wave of heather honey and sweet malt. The Whisky.dk notes describe it almost like a working bakery mixed with a citrus grove.
Oh, nice.
You get bright green apples, sharp lemon zest, and a touch of almond nuttiness. And then the moment it hits the palate, you get that signature, undeniable waxy mouthfeel.
Right.
It physically coats the tongue. It feels incredibly substantial and heavy in the mouth, even though the flavor profile itself is bright and airy.
It sounds incredibly vibrant. A perfect balance of distillery character and gentle oak influence. Now, what happens to that specific chemical structure when you leave it in the wood for another 6 years? Let's talk about the oxidative aging of the Deanston 18-year-old.
The 18-year-old is an absolute masterclass in extended maturation. It builds directly on the structural foundation of the 12. But because it has had 6 more years of microoxygenation through the porous oak, those thick-walled stone warehouses, everything gets darker, richer, and exponentially more concentrated.
I can imagine.
The light heather honey becomes a deep, viscous, almost dark-roasted honey. The light vanilla turns into rich, heavy toffee. You start getting complex notes of dried fruit sultanas, apricot, maybe a hint of fig,
Yeah.
and a much more pronounced, warming oak spice from the extended extraction of wood tannins.
But importantly, looking at the tasting notes, the source emphasizes that the 18-year-old still maintains that clean, airy Highland fruit at its absolute core. The wood hasn't completely conquered the spirit. The DNA is still legible.
Exactly. The structural integrity of that 100-hour fermentation and that waxy, heavy distillation shines right through 18 years of relentless oak interaction.
Yeah.
It is a testament to how robust the underlying spirit actually is.
But Deanston isn't just resting on its laurels with traditional bourbon casks anymore. The Whisky.dk profile highly emphasizes that under CVH, they have become incredibly adept at a whole range of experimental cask finishes and limited editions.
Oh, yeah.
We are talking heavy red wine finishes, vintage port pipes, Oloroso sherry butts, Bordeaux casks, certified organic releases, and even virgin oak, meaning heavily charred American oak barrels that have never held any other liquid before.
And this is exactly where that waxy, heavily textured base spirit proves its ultimate versatility in the modern market.
I want to hypothesize on the chemistry of this because it makes me think of an architectural analogy. The base spirit is like a massive, heavy-duty concrete foundation.
Right.
If you take a very weak, highly refluxed, delicate spirit, like a subtle lowland malt, and you rack it into a highly active, heavy red wine or Bordeaux cask, the aggressive tannins and heavy fruit notes of the wine will just instantly obliterate the whiskey.
Yeah.
It will taste like fortified wine. The distillery character is crushed under the weight of the cask.
That happens all the time in the industry. It is called being over-oaked or over-finished.
Right. But Deanston's spirit has that massive lipid weight, that structural waxiness. It is an over-engineered foundation. Its clean, ester-heavy, fruity base can carry those heavy, vinous, aggressively spicy layers of a Bordeaux or port cask without the original identity collapsing under the sheer weight of the wood extractives.
That is a phenomenal way to articulate it. The inherent fruitiness of the Deanston spirit intertwines with the dark, jammy fruit of a port or red wine cask in this beautiful symbiotic way.
Nice.
And because those wine casks often impart heavy tannins, they end with a very dry, structured, almost astringent finish. But that astringency plays perfectly against the naturally slick, waxy mouthfeel of the Deanston spirit.
The contrast.
It creates this dynamic tension in the glass slick wax versus dry tannin that is incredibly engaging for an advanced whiskey drinker to parse out. It proves definitively that the Adelphi Mills spirit can handle both the classic restrained ex-bourbon maturation and the wilder, highly extractive experimental cask types without ever losing its core identity.
Okay, so taking a step back from the microanalysis of the tasting notes, let's pull the lens all the way out and look at the macro picture. We have covered a massive amount of ground here.
We really have.
We have dissected the 1785 architecture, the arc-rate cotton mill, the macroeconomic devastation of the 1980s crash, the corporate portfolio strategies of Distill and CVH,
The hydroturbine engineering.
the osmotic stress of the worts, the thermodynamic physics of the wax, and the oxidative chemistry of the wood. When you synthesize this entire centuries-long journey, what does this massive brutalist cotton mill actually mean for the wider global world of whiskey today?
I think the Whisky.dk analysis absolutely nails the macro perspective when they define Deanston as the ultimate crowning second wave success story of the modern era.
I love that terminology. Define the parameters of the second wave in this specific industry context.
Well, the first wave of globally famous single malts were the pioneers who saw the writing on the wall early and started marketing themselves aggressively as single malts decades ago. The Glenfiddich, the Macallans, the Glenrangis.
The big names.
Right. They built the global category and established the luxury parameters. The second wave refers directly to distilleries like Deanston. Massive, highly efficient plants that were built or drastically expanded in the 1960s and 70s purely to serve as anonymous industrial workhorses for the blended whiskey market.
Okay.
They possessed absolutely zero brand identity of their own. They were just unseen cogs in a larger machine.
They were just factories making a raw ingredient for someone else's recipe.
Exactly. But over the last 2 decades, as the single malt market has exploded globally and highly educated consumers have demanded more variety, more transparency, and more structural complexity, these second-wave distilleries have been forced to step out of the shadows.
Right.
And Deanston is arguably the most structurally successful example in the entire industry of reinventing oneself from an anonymous bulk blend fodder factory into a highly respected, fiercely protected, premium, character-driven single malt.
And a massive part of that success, according to the thesis of the Whisky.dk profile, is their unwavering commitment to authenticity over aesthetics.
This is a crucial industry-defining point. We currently live in an era of what you could cynically call design distilleries.
Oh, totally. You see these new operations popping up, backed by massive venture capital, and they have spent tens of millions of dollars before they even distill a single drop of alcohol.
Yep.
They hire world-famous architectural firms to build these sleek, hyper-modern glass and steel visitor centers that look like contemporary art museums or Bond villain lairs.
Yeah.
They are trying desperately to manufacture a sense of heritage, to engineer a premium lifestyle brand from scratch.
And look, there is absolutely nothing wrong with beautiful modern architecture, but Deanston represents the total uncompromising opposite approach.
Yeah.
Deanston uses its brutal, monolithic, authentic industrial architecture as its primary strength. When you walk into the courtyard at Deanston, you are not walking into a romanticized, whitewashed farmyard designed by a marketing agency.
No.
You are walking into the massive, echoing, heavy load-bearing halls of a working 18th century cotton mill. It is a piece of hard, uncompromising working-class Scottish industrial history.
You can literally taste the industrial transition in the glass. The fact that they power the massive site with a hydro turbine in the river outside isn't some cute, greenwashed eco-story they dreamed up in a corporate boardroom in London.
Right.
It is just the physical reality of inhabiting an 18th century water-powered mill.
Yeah.
They're just making complex ethanol instead of spinning cotton textiles, but the heavy industrial soul of the building hasn't changed an iota.
That gives Deanston an unassailable authenticity that simply cannot be faked, bought, or manufactured, no matter how much venture capital a new distillery spends. The history of labor, of collapse, and of reinvention is soaked directly into the stones of the maturation warehouses.
It is so true, and I firmly believe that ethos translates directly to the liquid. As Whisky.dk elegantly puts it in their closing analytics, Deanston isn't the loudest malt in Scotland. It is not hitting you over the head with aggressive medicinal campfire peat smoke.
No.
And it is not drowning you in cloying, heavily sugared sherry syrup to mask flaws in the spirit.
It is not relying on cheap organoleptic gimmicks to grab your attention.
Right. It is a whiskey that demands and rewards intellectual attention. It rewards patience. It is formulated for the drinker who wants to sit down, analyze the glass, and appreciate the highly subtle interplay of ester-driven orchard fruit, complex malt honey, and that unique, heavy, waxy texture that can only be generated by the specific thermodynamic physics of those 4 specific stills inside that specific stone building.
It is a thinker's whiskey, born in a heavy worker's building.
A thinker's whiskey, born in a worker's building. I absolutely love that encapsulation. So let's recap this massive historical and biochemical journey we have been on today, because it is quite a ride. Next time you pour yourself a dram of Deanston, whether you are analyzing that benchmark 12-year-old, dissecting the deep oxidative complexity of the 18-year-old, or wrestling with the tannic structure of one of those wild red wine cask finishes, I want you to really deeply think about the mechanics of what is actually in your glass.
You are tasting the cold, rushing, kinetic water power of the River Teith being converted into electricity. You are tasting the thick stone thermal mass and heavy steel infrastructure of an 18th century cotton mill designed by Richard Arkwright.
You are tasting the absolute terrifying silence and near-death economic experience of the 1982 whiskey lock crisis, when the stills were stone cold and the future was entirely blank.
You are tasting the strategic rebirth under Burn Stewart's blender toolkit, the global portfolio positioning under Distell, and the current uncompromising triumph of modern, sustainable, biochemically character-driven distillation under CVH Spirits.
It is an incredible, highly complex story of macroeconomic survival and physical evolution. And it leaves me with a broader, perhaps more philosophical thought that I really want to put to you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive is over. We just spent an hour dissecting how Deanston categorically proved that a massive, entirely obsolete 18th century industrial factory could be brilliantly, seamlessly repurposed. They took a cavernous space built for grinding, repetitive industrial labor and completely transformed it to create something warm, biochemically complex, highly artisanal, and deeply human, all while generating its own clean power from the river rushing outside its walls.
Right.
So as we look around our own modern 21st century landscape at the abandoned industrial monoliths of our own era, I'm talking about the dead, sprawling, million-square-foot suburban shopping malls, the empty, cavernous, automated car manufacturing plants resting in the Rust Belt, the deserted, hyper-wide, glass-paneled suburban office parks and server farms left behind by shifting tech paradigms. What is the second wave of reinvention waiting for them?
That is a fascinating question.
What amazing, artisanal, uniquely human creation is just waiting to be engineered and poured out of the ruins of our own abandoned industries 100 years from now, when someone looks at a dead data center and says, this is the perfect physical shell for something beautiful.
Wow.
It is something to deeply consider next time you drive past an empty factory. Thank you so much for joining us on this massive deep dive into the fascinating, rigorous source material provided by Whisky.dk. Until next time, keep analyzing the mechanics, keep questioning the aesthetics, and keep diving deep.